Jesse, you could at least try to look like you have some real military discipline, Bradley laughed loudly, raising his beer toward the family gathered in the backyard. I mean, anyone can fly a few little planes in the comfort of the base, right? The laughter echoed through the family barbecue in San Diego, each laugh cutting deeper than the last. My wife, Amanda, looked down in embarrassment as the children ran around the yard, oblivious to the humiliation I was facing once again. Across the table, Captain Thomas Hartwell, Bradley's father and Navy SEAL legend, remained silent. His gray eyes watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read as he took a sip of beer and maintained his impeccable military posture even in a casual setting. Dad here knows what it's like to really serve, Bradley continued, patting his father on the back. Special operations, classified missions, the guy saved real lives. Not like those routine patrols you do flying around in circles. My name is Jesse Mitchell, and at 32, I never imagined I'd be sitting silently while my brother-in-law made me the family clown once again. But after 5 years of marriage to Amanda and countless barbecues where Bradley flaunted his supposed superiority, I learned that some truths were too heavy to share. Especially when those truths carried the weight of lives saved in hostile territories and missions that would never see the light of day. As Bradley gestured animatedly, recounting for the 1,000th time his CrossFit workouts and how they prepared him for real combat, I kept my face neutral. The same expression I wore when flying information through anti-aircraft fire, when rescue coordinates came in encrypted over the radio, when men screamed for exfiltration in war zones. What Bradley didn't know was that 3 years ago, in the mountains of Afghanistan, his own SEAL unit had been surrounded by insurgents. 2 hours of intense fire, ammunition running low, no visible way out. That's when the radio crackled with a transmission that would change everything. Alpha Team, this is Ghost 60. Hold your positions. I'm on my way. Ghost 60. My call sign. That night, I flew through a corridor of fire that made 20-year veterans cry with relief when they landed on safe ground. Among the men I carried out of that hell was Thomas Hartwell himself, unconscious and bleeding, but alive. Jesse has always been a bit quiet, Amanda murmured, trying to smooth things over. He prefers not to talk much about work. Because there's not much to talk about, Bradley laughed, almost spilling his beer. I bet the guy has never even seen real action. Those pilots stay up there, far away from the real danger. I smiled and nodded, as I always did. Silence was safer than the truth. Safer than explaining why my hand didn't shake when holding a beer, even after flying missions where the margin for error was measured in centimeters. Safer than revealing why I slept only 4 hours a night, and why Amanda sometimes found me in the garage at 3 a.m, organizing tools with the military precision Bradley mocked. Thomas continued to watch me silently, and for a moment our eyes met. There was something different there, an intensity one couldn't quite interpret. As if he were trying to fit together pieces of a puzzle that only he could see. Actually, Thomas's deep voice cut through the air for the first time that evening. I'm curious about your job, Jesse. What kind of missions do you fly? Bradley laughed before I could answer. Dad, he probably just does training flights and cargo transport. Nothing too exciting. As the family laughed again, I kept my gaze fixed on Thomas. There was something in his eyes that told me this conversation was far from over. And for the first time in 5 years, part of me wished it wasn't. If you're enjoying discovering the secrets behind this seemingly perfect family, be sure to subscribe to the channel to see how this story of underestimation would turn into a revelation that would change everything forever. But at that moment, as Bradley continued his performance for the captivated audience, I had no idea that Thomas's next question would set off a chain of events that would turn that family barbecue into the most tense night of our lives. Bradley had always been like this. From the day I met Amanda 6 years ago, he turned every family gathering into a silent competition where I always came out the loser. Not by accident, he orchestrated every situation with the precision of someone who studied theater in college before dropping out to focus on fitness and entrepreneurship. At 28, Bradley Hartwell had built an entire career on his father's name. Owner of 3 gyms in San Diego, all financed by family investment, he sold the image of military discipline without ever having set foot on a base. His clients paid a premium to train with the son of the legendary Captain Hartwell, while he repeated military jargon he had learned from watching action movies. Jesse, have you ever considered serious training? He continued, flexing his biceps as he turned a piece of meat on the grill. I mean, flying may require coordination, but it doesn't develop real strength. Look at this. He pounded his inflated chest, eliciting forced laughter from the guests. My mother-in-law, Patricia, sighed with barely concealed pride. Bradley has always been our family athlete. Just like his father. Thomas remained silent, but I noticed how his fingers drummed on the table. A habit I recognized from other veterans, the kind of involuntary movement that arises when someone is processing conflicting information. Amanda told me you fly mostly domestic missions, Bradley continued, now addressing me directly with that condescending smile I knew so well. Must be nice, huh? Clear skies, no real pressure. Domestic missions. If only he knew that 3 weeks ago I had flown an emergency exfiltration in hostile territory, carrying wounded soldiers through a storm that had brought down 2 less experienced helicopters. If he knew that the report from that mission was locked away in a classified folder with my signature on it, along with thank you letters from families I would never meet. Every flight has its challenges, I replied diplomatically, taking another sip of beer. Sure, Bradley waved his hand, as if being kind to a child. But it's not like real operations, right, Dad? Tell him about Ramadi. Thomas finally spoke, his voice cutting through the air with natural authority. Bradley, not every military service needs to be glamorized. Oh, come on, Dad. Jesse can learn something. Tell him about that time you were surrounded for 2 days. I almost choked on my beer. Ramadi. 2 days surrounded. Thomas was talking about Operation Redlock, March 2021. I knew that story because I was there, flying reconnaissance circles for 48 consecutive hours, coordinating supplies and medical evacuation. Thomas studied me with renewed intensity. You know Ramadi, Jesse? I've heard a few stories, I replied carefully. Stories, Bradley laughed. Dad lived stories. You watch the History Channel. With every word, the weight of the irony became more absurd. Bradley was using his father's missions to humiliate me, unaware that I had participated in several of them. Worse, Thomas was beginning to connect dots that I preferred to keep separate. Amanda touched my arm gently. Jesse prefers not to talk about work at home. He's modest. Modest, or doesn't have much to talk about. Bradley teased, eliciting more laughter from those present. That's when Thomas stood up abruptly. Bradley, come help me with the drinks in the kitchen. Dad, I'm in the middle of a conversation. Now. His tone brooked no argument. Bradley grumbled but obeyed, following his father into the house. Through the kitchen window, I could see them engaged in an intense, silent conversation. Amanda approached me, concerned. Are you okay? I know Bradley can be over the top sometimes. Sometimes. As if it were an innocent habit, not a systematic 5-year campaign to make me feel inferior. As if every barbecue, every dinner, every family event weren't carefully planned to highlight my supposed inadequacies compared to the Hartwell's natural superiority. I'm fine, I lied, watching Thomas gesticulate as he spoke quietly with Bradley in the kitchen. When they returned, something had changed. Bradley seemed restrained, almost upset. Thomas took his place at the table with a serious expression I couldn't quite read. Jesse, he said slowly, what kind of helicopter do you fly? The question came out of nowhere, too specific to be casual. Various models. It depends on the mission. Black Hawks. My heart raced. I've flown a few. Interesting. Thomas took a long sip of beer. Bradley was telling me about your views on military pilots. Apparently, he thinks it's a job. How did you put it, son? Without any real risk. Bradley muttered something inaudible, clearly uncomfortable with the change in tone. Because I was thinking, Thomas continued, his eyes fixed on mine, about some extraordinary pilots I met during my service. Men and women who flew through impossible situations to save lives. Heroes who never received the recognition they deserved. Silence spread across the table. Each word carried a weight that went beyond small talk. In fact, Thomas added casually, there's one pilot in particular I never got to thank properly. Someone who risked everything to bring my team home on a very dark night in Afghanistan. My throat closed up. Amanda looked at me confused, sensing the tension without understanding its source. Perhaps, Thomas concluded, still watching me with those piercing gray eyes, it's time to find out who really deserves respect at this table. Bradley remained silent for the first time that evening, while I struggled to keep my expression neutral. But inside, A cold certainty spread. Thomas Hartwell was connecting dots that would lead to a revelation that would change everything. Thomas said nothing more for the rest of dinner, but I felt his gaze following me like military radar locked on target. My every move was catalogued, my every response analyzed. Bradley, oblivious to the mounting tension, took advantage of his father's silence to resume his personal show. "You know, Jesse," he said, cutting a generous piece of steak, "I was thinking you could benefit from some real training. I have a special program at the gym for guys who want to get out of their comfort zone." Amanda gave me an apologetic look. She knew what was coming. 5 years of marriage had taught me to recognize the signs when Bradley was building up to one of his more elaborate humiliations. "It's a program I developed based on the training my father did with the SEALs," he continued, gesturing dramatically. "Of course, adapted for people, let's say, less physically prepared." Patricia laughed, clapping her hands. "Oh, Bradley, you're so generous." "Jesse, what a wonderful opportunity." Generous. The word echoed in my mind as I watched Bradley's smug smile. If only he knew that 3 weeks ago I had completed a 16-hour consecutive flight through weather conditions that had brought down pilots with 20 years of experience. If only he knew that my physical training included survival simulations in hostile territory and endurance exercises that would make his CrossFit look like a warm-up. "Actually," Thomas interrupted gently, "I'd like to learn more about Jesse's work before we suggest improvements." Bradley laughed, ignoring the warning tone in his father's voice. "Dad, we've already talked about this. He flies routine domestic missions. There's not much to know." "Domestic missions," Thomas repeated slowly, as if savoring the words. "Interesting classification. Jesse, have you ever flown international missions?" The question was asked casually, but I recognized the technique. It was a military interrogation disguised as small talk. Thomas was fishing for specific information, probably trying to confirm a suspicion growing in his mind. "A few," I replied carefully. "A few," Bradley laughed loudly. "Probably carrying supplies to bases in the Caribbean. Nothing too dangerous." Thomas leaned forward, completely ignoring his son. "What kind of terrain do you consider most challenging for emergency landings?" My heart raced. It was too technical a question to be casual. Thomas was testing my knowledge, seeking confirmation of something he already suspected. "It depends on the conditions," I replied diplomatically. "Mountainous terrain presents unique challenges." "Like Afghanistan," Thomas said, his eyes narrowing slightly. Bradley snorted. "Dad, he's never been to Afghanistan. Look at him, he looks like he's afraid of his own shadow." That was the last straw. 5 years of disparaging comments, 5 years of being treated like the family's failed relative, 5 years of keeping my true identity buried under layers of military secrecy. But hearing Bradley call me a coward while his own father watched me with growing recognition was the limit I could no longer accept. "Actually," I began, my voice firmer than I intended, "I've flown a few missions in territory." "Territory what?" Bradley interrupted, laughing. "American territory doesn't count as a war zone, man." Amanda touched my arm again, sensing the change in my posture. "Maybe we can change the subject?" But Thomas wasn't willing to let it go. "Go on, Jesse. Territory what?" Silence spread across the table. Patricia stopped cutting the meat. The more distant guests noticed the tension and turned their attention to our conversation. Bradley smiled confidently, waiting for another opportunity to humiliate me publicly. "Hostile territory," I finally completed. Bradley burst out laughing. "Hostile territory. Man, you watch too many movies. The only hostile thing you faced was turbulence on the flight to Las Vegas." But Thomas wasn't laughing. His expression had become intense, focused. "What kind of hostile territory, Jesse?" "Dad, cut it out," Bradley protested. "You're taking his fantasies too seriously." Thomas finally looked at his son, and for the first time that evening, I saw genuine irritation in his eyes. "Bradley, could you be quiet for 5 minutes?" The sharp tone surprised everyone. Bradley recoiled, clearly shocked by the public rebuke. Thomas turned his attention to me. "Jesse, what years did you serve in Afghanistan?" The question was loaded with meaning. It was no longer whether I had served, but when. Thomas had connected enough dots to move from suspicion to near certainty. 2020 to 2022, I replied, feeling the weight of the partial revelation. Interesting period, Thomas murmured. A lot of rescue activity at that time. Bradley looked confused between the two of us. Wait, you were really in Afghanistan? Why didn't you ever mention that? Before I could answer, Amanda spoke up. Jesse doesn't like to talk about his military service. He said some things are too personal. Personal or classified? Thomas asked directly. The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Everyone at the table realized that something significant was happening, even if they didn't understand exactly what. Some operations have restrictions on what can be discussed, I admitted. Bradley seemed to be processing information that didn't fit with the image he had constructed of me. But, you never act like a war veteran. You never talk about it, you never use it as a credential. Maybe, Thomas said slowly, because some rail veterans don't need to prove anything to anyone. The implied criticism hit Bradley like a slap. He looked at his father, then at me, beginning to realize that he had spent 5 years mocking something he didn't understand. Thomas, Patricia interjected nervously, maybe this is a conversation for another time. But Thomas wasn't willing to stop. Actually, Patricia, I think this is exactly the right time. He turned back to me. Jesse, have you ever heard of Operation Redlock? My blood ran cold. It was the operation where I saved his life. Thomas wasn't fishing for information anymore. He was confirming a specific suspicion. Bradley looked completely lost. Dad, what is Operation Redlock? An operation where good men nearly died, Thomas replied without taking his eyes off me. And where an extraordinary pilot risked everything to bring us home. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone at the table realized they were witnessing something significant, a revelation that would fundamentally change the family dynamics they knew. Amanda looked at me with a mixture of surprise and growing pride. Jesse, you never told me about this. There's a lot Jesse never told us, Thomas said, his tone carrying respect and something that felt almost like reverence. And maybe it's time we all heard it. Bradley remained silent for the first time in years, his face running through a range of emotions as he tried to rearrange 5 years of assumptions about who I really was. But it was in that moment, seeing the expression of growing discomfort on Bradley's face and feeling the weight of Thomas's expectations, that I made a decision that carried much more weight than any rescue mission. It was time to stop pretending to be less than I really was. It was time to stop pretending to be less than I really was. Those words echoed in my mind as I watched Thomas study my face with the intensity of an experienced operator. Bradley remained silent, clearly confused, but Thomas had crossed the line from suspicion to something close to certainty. That night, after everyone had left, I found myself alone in the garage reorganizing tools that were already perfectly organized. It was a habit I had developed after the most intense missions, the need to bring order to small details when the world seemed too chaotic. Amanda appeared at the door, holding 2 beers. Do you want to talk about what happened today? I took the beer and kissed her gently. Thomas knows something. I don't know exactly what, but he's investigating. Is that bad? I thought for a moment. For 5 years, I had kept my military identity buried under layers of secrecy and forced modesty. I protected secrets that could destroy careers and expose sensitive operations. But I also protected Bradley from a truth that could publicly humiliate him. I don't know yet, I replied honestly. But something is going to change. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes in Thomas's behavior. He started showing up in unexpected places. At the coffee shop where I had lunch on Wednesdays. At the gas station I frequented. He never approached me directly, but I could feel his appraising gaze. It was military recognition in action. Thomas was conducting a discreet surveillance operation, confirming patterns of behavior that only a trained operator would exhibit. The way I scanned environments before entering. How I always parked my car with a quick exit available. How I maintained situational awareness even in casual conversations. Bradley, completely oblivious to his father's silent investigation, took advantage of my apparent vulnerability to intensify his provocations. He began telling stories about me to gym members, painting me as the failed brother-in-law who lived off the Hartwell family. The guy literally flies in circles for a living, I heard him tell a group of retired military personnel who frequented his gym. While my father saved lives in real operations, Jesse plays pilot on domestic missions. The words reached me through Amanda, who had heard them from a friend whose husband trained with Bradley. Each new humiliation was carefully crafted to appear casual, but the pattern was clear. Bradley was constructing a public narrative that diminished me in order to elevate his own image. That's when I started making some strategic decisions. First, I requested access to my unclassified military records. Not the details of covert operations, but certifications, awards, and service history that could be publicly verified. Information that any competent investigator could find with the right tools. Second, I began discreetly documenting Bradley's lies. Every exaggerated story about his own non-existent military experience. Every claim about SEAL training he never received. Every client duped by false credentials. Third, I initiated casual conversations with real veterans who frequented Bradley's gym. Not to expose him immediately, but to plant seeds of doubt about his inconsistent stories. Interesting how he knows so many details about operations he never participated in, I commented discreetly to retired Sergeant Williams, who had served in units similar to Thomas's. Williams frowned. You noticed that too? Some of his stories don't match actual protocols. As Bradley built his house of cards based on lies, I was systematically documenting every inconsistency. Not out of petty revenge, but because the truth deserved to be protected. Especially when he used his father's name and reputation to deceive people who genuinely respected military service. Thomas, for his part, stepped up his own investigation. One morning, I found him waiting in the parking lot of the base where I work. Jesse, he said without preamble, I need to ask you some direct questions. Okay. Are you familiar with the codename Ghost 60? My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression neutral. I've heard a few references. Interesting. Thomas leaned against his truck, clearly choosing his words carefully. Because that pilot saved my life. And the lives of 3 other men on a very specific night in March 2021. Silence stretched between us. I could deny it, deflect, maintain the facade I had carefully constructed over the years. Or I could begin to reveal truths that would fundamentally change our family dynamic. Thomas, I began slowly, there are some things about my service that are complicated to discuss. Complicated as in classified? Complicated as in personal. He nodded, understanding the distinction. Jesse, if you are who I think you are, then Bradley has spent 5 years humiliating a war hero. What if I am? Then it's time for him to learn some truths that are going to hurt. That night, I made my final decision. I called my former commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, and requested permission to disclose specific aspects of my service record. Not classified operational details, but confirmation of code names, dates of service, and decorations that had been kept secret for security reasons. Mitchell, Martinez's voice came clear through the phone. Why now? Family matters, sir. Situations that require clarification. There was a pause. Are you sure? Once this information becomes public, there's no turning back. I'm sure. Very well. I'll process the release. Jesse, you deserve recognition for what you did. You always have. While waiting for the official documentation, I began to psychologically prepare myself for what was to come. 5 years of silent humiliation were about to turn into public revelation. Bradley would discover that he had spent half a decade mocking the man who saved his father's life. If you're following this journey of discovery and wondering how military secrets can transform family dynamics, be sure to subscribe to the channel to see how buried truths have the power to completely rewrite the hierarchies we thought we knew. 2 days later, Thomas called me. Jesse, I got some information through old contacts. Information about a pilot named Ghost 60. And what did you find out? I found out that this pilot not only saved my team, but completed 17 high-risk rescue missions. He received decorations that most military personnel only see at ceremonies. And he kept it all quiet for reasons of national security. The weight of the words hung in the air. Thomas had independently confirmed what he suspected. Jesse, he continued, his voice thick with restrained emotion, if you are Ghost 60, then my family owes you a debt we can never repay. And an explanation that is 5 years overdue. Thomas. Bradley doesn't know who you are. And when he finds out, He'll have to rebuild everything he thought he knew about courage, service, and true heroism. I hung up the phone knowing I had crossed the point of no return. The next 48 hours would determine whether years of protective silence would turn into deserved recognition or a family explosion that could fragment relationships forever. But for the first time in 5 years, I slept soundly. The truth was about to emerge, and I was ready to face whatever consequences it would bring. Thomas's call came on a Thursday morning. "Jesse, I need you to come to dinner with us tonight. There are some people I'd like you to meet." His voice carried a formality that hadn't been there before, as if he were following a specific protocol. Amanda noticed my hesitation. "Is it about Bradley?" she asked. "It's about truths that need to be told," I replied, already knowing that Thomas had completed his investigation. When we arrived at the Hartwells' house that evening, we found a setting that was completely different from the casual barbecues of the past. Thomas had invited 4 men whom I recognized immediately, veterans of his former SEAL unit. Faces I had only seen in military briefings years ago, now sitting civilly in the dining room. Bradley seemed confused by the unusual formality. "Dad, what's going on? Why is everyone so serious?" "Son," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the weight of years of command, "today you will meet the man who saved my life." The silence that followed was thick. Bradley looked around the table, clearly expecting one of the veterans to identify himself as the hero of the story. Sergeant Collins, a 50-year-old man with visible scars on his neck, broke the silence. "Captain Hartwell told us that Ghost 60 would be here today." My heart raced, but I kept my expression neutral. Thomas had orchestrated this like a military operation, controlled disclosure with credible witnesses. "Phantom 60. Bradley laughed nervously. "What kind of code name is that?" "The kind of code name," Thomas replied slowly, "you earn by flying through anti-aircraft fire to rescue men who thought they were going to die." That's when I noticed that Thomas had strategically placed a folder on the table. Official military documents, mission photographs, and what appeared to be communication logs. "Jesse," Thomas said, looking me straight in the eye, "would you like to tell us about the night of March 22, 2021? The date echoed through the room like a gunshot. It was the night of Operation Redlock, when I flew an emergency exfiltration that saved the lives of Thomas and 3 other men. Bradley looked confused between us. "Dad, what does Jesse have to do with your missions? He only flies domestic missions." Sergeant Williams, another veteran at the table, let out a dry laugh. "Domestic missions? Kid, Ghost 60 has completed 17 high-risk rescues in hostile territory." 17, Thomas confirmed, opening his briefcase and revealing official documents. "Including the mission that saved my life when our unit was surrounded by insurgents in the Afghan mountains." The color drained from Bradley's face. "Wait, are you saying that, Jesse?" "I'm saying," Thomas interrupted, "that for 5 years you mocked the man who risked his life so I could come home. So you could have your father alive." The moment of recognition washed over Bradley's face in waves. First disbelief, then confusion, followed by a gradual and devastating realization of what he had been doing. "This can't be right," Bradley murmured. He never acts like a war hero." "Because," Collins said gravely, "real heroes don't have to prove anything to anyone." Thomas opened another document. "Jesse Mitchell, codename Ghost 60. 17 successful rescue missions. 0 casualties under his command. Medal for extraordinary valor, classified for national security reasons." Each word was like a hammer destroying 5 years of narrative Bradley had built about me. Amanda held my hand, her eyes shining with pride and surprise. "But I don't understand," Bradley continued, clearly struggling to reorganize his perception of reality. "Why didn't he ever say anything? Why did he let you humiliate him publicly?" Thomas finished, his voice now laden with paternal reproach. "Perhaps because he understands something you haven't yet learned about true character." Sergeant Collins leaned forward. "Boy, your father told me about how you treat Jesse. Like a zombie of a man who flew through hell to bring us home." The atmosphere in the room had become electrically tense. Bradley looked desperately at me, as if seeking denial or an explanation that might minimize his growing humiliation. "Jesse," he said in a strangled voice, "if that's true, why didn't you ever tell me?" I spoke for the first time since we arrived. Because some things are more important than proving who's right. Thomas opened one last folder, revealing photographs of our unit in Afghanistan. Bradley, here is the official mission report. Read the part where it describes how Ghost 60 flew a Black Hawk through intense fire to evacuate us. Bradley took the document with trembling hands and began to read aloud. The pilot demonstrated exceptional courage, flying under extremely dangerous conditions to complete the exfiltration. Without his intervention, the unit would have suffered significant casualties. His voice faltered on the last sentence. The reality of what he had been doing for 5 years finally crystallized. He had spent years mocking the man who had allowed him to still have a living father. Williams looked directly at Bradley. Son, you spent 5 years humiliating a national hero. A man who saved lives while you played soldier at a college. Thomas stood up and walked over to where I was sitting. Jesse, on behalf of my unit and my family, I apologize for what you endured. And I ask your permission to do something I should have done 5 years ago. He stood at attention and offered me a respectful salute. One by one, the other veterans did the same. Bradley watched in absolute silence, realizing he was witnessing the kind of recognition he had spent years pretending to deserve. Ghost 60, Thomas said solemnly, thank you for bringing this father home. But as I returned the salute, knowing that 5 years of silent humiliation were finally coming to an end, I noticed out of the corner of my eye that Bradley had begun to cry. The real transformation was yet to come. The tears streaming down Bradley's face were not just from embarrassment, they were from a devastating realization that rewrote 5 years of his own identity. Thomas held the military salute as he watched his son process the magnitude of what he had discovered. Bradley, Collins said softly, your reaction now determines what kind of man you truly are. There was a long silence before Bradley slowly rose to his feet. His hands trembled as he stood before me, clearly struggling to find words appropriate for a situation that transcended any previous experience. Jesse, his voice was strangled, I have no words to. For 5 years I humiliated the man who saved my father. Amanda squeezed my hand, watching the transformation happen in real time. Patricia, who had remained silent throughout the revelation, finally spoke in a broken voice. Jesse, forgive our son. Forgive our family. I looked at Bradley, seeing not the arrogant young man who had tormented me for years, but a man confronting the complete destruction of his self-image. Bradley, the issue isn't forgiveness. The issue is what you will do with this truth. He nodded desperately. Anything. I would do anything to undo what I've done. Thomas approached his son. Son, you spent 5 years building a career based on my name while humiliating the man who allowed me to live on to be your father. Jesse never used his accomplishments for personal gain. He never sought recognition. He never took advantage of the respect he deserved. The reality of those words hit Bradley like a tsunami. His gyms, his clients, his entire reputation, all built on the shadow of a father whose life had been saved by the man he publicly disparaged. My clients, Bradley murmured, realizing the implications. All these veterans who train with me because they respect our family, they need to know who you really are. Williams leaned forward. Son, some of these men have probably heard of Ghost 60. When they find out that the man you called a failure is a military legend. Bradley's humiliation deepened, but something interesting happened. Instead of retreating or defending himself, he straightened his shoulders, for the first time displaying genuinely military posture. Then they'll know the truth, he said with growing determination. Everyone will know. In the months that followed, Bradley turned his humiliation into a personal mission. He closed 2 of his 3 gyms and converted the remaining one into a free rehabilitation center for veterans. Each session began with him telling the story of how he had discovered that the real hero was right under his nose. My name is Bradley Hartwell, I heard him say in a lecture 6 months later, and for 5 years I humiliated a war hero because I was so obsessed with living in my father's shadow that I forgot to learn what it really means to serve. The gym became a sanctuary for veterans struggling with civilian reintegration. Bradley, now humble and focused on real purpose, discovered something that years of self-promotion had never provided: genuine respect earned through authentic service. Thomas and I developed a friendship that transcended military hierarchies. We began visiting schools together, talking about real military values versus cinematic glorification. He talked about leadership and strategy. I talked about quiet courage and decisions under pressure. The difference between a real hero and someone who pretends to be a hero, Thomas said in one of these lectures, is that the real hero never has to tell his own stories. Amanda, who had observed 5 years of silent humiliation without fully understanding its context, developed new pride in my choice to maintain discretion. "You could have destroyed Bradley at any time," she said one night, "but you chose to protect the family's dignity." "Destroying Bradley wouldn't have saved his father's life," I replied. "And it wouldn't have made our marriage stronger." A year after the revelation, Bradley approached me with an unexpected proposal. "Jesse, I want you to be my partner in the gym. Not as a silent investor, but as a co-owner. Veterans deserve to be trained by someone who truly understands what they've been through." I politely declined. My mission was not to replace one form of recognition with another, but to continue serving without the need for external validation. 2 years later, I received a phone call that would change everything again. The Secretary of the Navy was declassifying certain operations, including several Ghost 60 missions. A recognition ceremony was being planned for pilots whose achievements had remained secret for reasons of national security. At the ceremony, as I received awards that had been locked away in classified files, I observed the audience. Thomas was in the front row, in full uniform, smiling with paternal pride. Bradley was beside him, no longer the arrogant young man obsessed with status, but a man who had learned the difference between fame and purpose. During my speech, I talked about something I had learned through experience. The true test of character is not how you act when everyone is watching, but how you behave when no one knows who you really are. After the ceremony, Bradley approached me. "Jesse, I have something for you." He handed me a framed photograph, the official image of Operation Redlock with our rescue team. "This photo sat in my father's office for 5 years. Now I know you should have been in it from the beginning." I looked at the photograph and smiled. "Bradley, you've learned the most important lesson. Real recognition comes from within, not from photographs or certificates." Today, when people ask about the years of quiet humiliation, I explain that every moment served a greater purpose. It protected sensitive operations, kept families together, and most importantly, taught lessons about humility and purpose that no amount of public recognition could provide. Bradley now runs the most respected rehabilitation center in the state. Not because he uses his father's name, but because he dedicates each day to serving men and women who have sacrificed more than most people can imagine. If this story of transformation through truth and humility has touched your heart, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how patience and integrity always triumph over arrogance and lies. The lesson I learned was not about revenge or poetic justice, but about something deeper. Sometimes, the greatest power we possess is the choice of when and how to reveal who we really are. And when we make that choice for the right reason, at the right time, it transforms not only our lives, but the lives of everyone around us. True heroism is not about being recognized for your actions, but about continuing to do the right thing regardless of who is watching.